My name's Mark Williamson, and welcome to Build a Happier Life. This really exciting theme. We're going to be talking about how self-care and caring for others are completely interrelated. We're going to be looking at the science of well-being, and we're going to be talking about, this question that the Beatles were asking us when they said, "All you need is love." Is that actually the secret to happiness? Well, stay tuned in, and you'll hopefully find out. And I'm completely delighted to be joined by someone who is an inspiration to me and so many of us, and a real hero of this happiness movement. Arthur Brooks, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Delight to be with you and all of our friends at Action for Happiness, dedicated to building a happier world.
Yeah, well, thank you. For anyone who is new to this, as Arthur's just said, this is a community of people doing exactly that, trying to take action on our own lives, not just to be happier ourselves, but also to contribute to a better, happier, kinder world. And there are so many ways that you can get involved if you're new to this, volunteering, being part of this amazing community. So all of you regulars, welcome back. We'll be keeping it kind and relevant in the chat as always, but please do get involved, support each other. We're going to do a couple of interactive things along the way. And of course, you'll have a chance to put your questions to Arthur later in this event, once he and I have had a chance to talk about some of these themes, about how to build a happier life. So Arthur needs no introduction, but is, obviously got so much experience in this area, an author, an expert. And I guess I wanted to ask you to start with, Arthur. It seems to many slightly incongruous that somebody at a business school at Harvard is talking about like a topic like happiness. Of course, all of us here are intrinsically drawn to it, but maybe you could give us a little bit of the backstory as to how you became so connected to this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and I appreciate the question. It's happiness is something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. I'm a behavioral scientist, like so many people in the field. I was trained as a behavioral economist of all things, but that's more or less the same toolkit as most people in the social psychology world. When I was in my early work after getting my PhD, I was doing work on beauty. I was doing work on charitable giving to other people. And the taproot, the common theme there was that people wanted to be happier and wanted to bring more happiness to others. And I thought, well, I should write about the big thing, which incidentally, it's what I want more of as well. Now, I always thought about happiness in the wrong way in the early days of my career. I thought about it kind of like an astronomer thinks of the stars. It's something you can observe, but not something you can actually change. It came much later as I got older, as my brain started to mature from intelligence to wisdom, I suppose. And it's one of the things I've written about quite a lot, that I started to think, I wonder if I can actually manage to bring these ideas to others. And about 5 years ago, I rededicated myself to doing that. I had spent a number of years away from academia. I was the CEO of a big think tank in Washington, D.C., a research organization dedicated to better public policy. And I retired from that. I mean, retired is a way of speaking. I was not old enough to retire, but I stepped down after 11 years. And I thought, what do I want to do? And I spent a period of discernment and reflection. I went away on a silent retreat, and I came out of it realizing that really my goal for the rest of my life is to spend the years that I have productively lifting people up and bringing them together in bonds of happiness and love as a scientist, using science and ideas. And that's what I've done. So I pitched that to a number of universities who were asking me to join them. And when the Harvard Business School came to me and said, why don't you come be an economist at the Harvard Business School? I said, okay, but what I really think you need, and what I'm going to do, is I'm going to teach a science class on happiness where I'm teaching leaders to become happiness teachers. See, this is the secret, Mark. It's not just a question of how can I be happier. It's how can I make the world a happier place through my ordinary work. That's the value proposition that I was trying to promote. And I said, if we have a class called Leadership and Happiness, where all leaders can see themselves more as happiness teachers, starting with themselves, of course, then we actually have leverage. They gave me the slot. They give it a shot, and see how it turns out. The class quickly became the most popular elective at the Harvard Business School. The most popular elective at the Harvard Business School is a happiness class. I mean, why? Everybody for Action for Happiness knows why. We want to be happier as people. Now I have 180 students in the class. I have 400 on the waiting list, and there's even an illegal Zoom link they think I'm not aware of. Now we have a symposium through my lab in Leadership and Happiness where we're teaching other academics all around the world how to teach the class. It's not about me. It's about the topic that everybody in Action for Happiness knows is what the world craves more of. And I'm in the privileged position to be able to talk about it every day.
Yeah, well, we're very happy that you've given up some time to talk to us about it. And what I'd like to do in this time is to explore both the personal aspect of this, and of course, you've got a community here who have a real connection to this topic, but also, as you've already hinted at, how we can apply this in our lives to help those around us as well.
Right.
And where I wanted to start afterwards, the last time I saw you speak was at the World Happiness Summit, where we both were, and of course, connected via our mutual friend Karen Guggenheim there. But one of the things you said in your wonderful talk was referring back to, I think, the book you've written with Oprah, and the fact that she and you both talk about maybe the quest we're on is towards happiness rather than happiness as an absolute goal. This idea that this is not about some utopian end point, but more about the journey we're on and the sort of almost incremental improvements we can make to make life better. I wondered if you could say a bit about that, about this idea of happier rather than happy in absolute terms.
Of course. One of the things that I usually start my classes with, and when I'm talking about happiness with audience who are uninitiated, with some information that's probably pretty familiar to everybody in this movement, which is that mistakes that we make really hold us back in our quest for greater happiness. So one of them is that thinking that happiness is a feeling. Happiness isn't a feeling. It's evidence. Feelings are evidence of happiness, like the smell of the turkey is evidence of your Thanksgiving dinner. Sorry for the American reference, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. That if we were trying to live according to finding better feelings, that's like trying to have dinner only to get the best possible scent. I want the food. And so that's why it's a good scientific pursuit. That's the first mistake. The second mistake is the thinking that if we just live according to our base desires, that somehow that will lead us to happiness, as if Mother Nature really cared. You know, Mother Nature wants us to pass on our genes. Mother Nature wants us to survive. But happiness is a higher order thing, and we have to be responsible for that. And sometimes we have to contravene our impulses in lots of ways, which is a very interesting and wonderful truth. But last but not least is your point. The biggest mistake I think that we make is when I ask people what they want, they say, I want to be happy, as if there's some Shangri-La, some end state in the current mortal coil in which you no longer have negative emotions and you no longer have negative experiences. Well, good luck to you. Negative emotions are part of life, and we have them because we want to survive. We want to survive another day. Emotions are nothing more than an indication to you that something is a threat and should be avoided. And that's part of normal life. Fear, anger, disgust, sadness. These are normal things. We should be grateful for them. That's the reason we've survived as well as we have as a species, is because of negative emotions. And negative experiences are happening because we're interacting with people, and some of the interactions that we have, some of the experiences that we have are not to our liking. That's an opportunity to learn and grow. One of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to get rid of their unhappiness, because when they do that, what they'll be doing is they'll be trying to avoid or eradicate negative emotions, which is irresponsible and impossible and bad for your mental health. And they'll be trying to avoid negative experiences, which means that they won't learn and grow. We need to manage our negative emotions as opposed to trying to eradicate them. And the result of that is that the right end goal is not perfect happiness. The right end goal is getting happier. Now, when I told this to my co-author, Oprah Winfrey, she's not a happiness specialist. She got together with me on this project because she's an enthusiast for this. And she said, so you keep saying that the goal isn't happiness. And I said, that's correct. I said, it's progress in happiness. She said, so the real goal is happiness. She's good with language. And I said, you just encapsulated the last 30 years of my career better than I can, and it took you 5 minutes. But that really is the goal, is happiness.
I love happiness. And it hints at something that is at the heart of what we're doing with Action for Happiness. And I sense is at the heart of your work, Arthur. And I often hear in the world around us that the suggestion that trying to pursue a happier way of living is unhelpful. You know, you can kind of leave yourself miserable, or it's like, it's not good use of time. You're better off just living and sort of happiness as a byproduct. And I personally find that to be unhelpful advice, in the same way that there are good and bad ways to look after your physical health, or good and bad ways to pursue almost anything. It feels to me that there are indeed very good ways to pursue happiness, and indeed some pretty awful ways that we're told by consumer culture, only caring about yourself, pursuing happiness through things and external status. So I guess my question is that right in your view, that there are practical things, regardless of our situation, that can make a difference and are worth pursuing?
Absolutely. We absolutely know that's the case. Now, the way that we find the right strategies is by finally defining happiness correctly. It's not a feeling. It's really a combination of three major phenomena in life. And so this is the macronutrient philosophy of happiness, or theory of happiness. Sort of like saying that food is protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Happiness is a combination of enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. Those are the three big macronutrients. And we know this from the scientific literature that shows very clearly that people who have these three things in balance and abundance in their lives tend to be the happiest people. Don't try to get happiness. That's an elusive goal. It doesn't even make sense. Pursue understanding how it gets done, and as scientifically and as disciplined a way as possible. Enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. Those are the three streams to be swimming in. So enjoyment is not pleasure, by the way. It has pleasure in it, but it requires people and meaning. It's a brain fully alive. Satisfaction is the joy of accomplishment after some struggle. And meaning is the idea that life has coherence and purpose and significance. And each one of those things has a vast scientific literature and leads to all kinds of practices, both transcendental, even spiritual practices, as well as intellectual knowledge. It's the work of a lifetime to be pursuing all three of those things. Those are the things to be thinking about, not just the airy-fairy concept of happiness, which won't lead us in the right direction because we can't define it cognitively.
So I think that's a brilliantly put analogy with the food and the macronutrients and that idea of enjoyment, satisfaction, meaning. I would love us to turn at this point to our community here live, Arthur, just briefly, and maybe to sort of illustrate examples of what you've just said in these categories. Maybe you and I can respond to say, but I would invite you, wherever you are right now tuning in, to think about what contributes to happiness, to use Oprah's word, for you. What are some of the behaviors and factors in your life, just saying a few words in the chat, that contribute to happiness for you, and we'll see how they relate to what Arthur said about enjoyment and so on. So I'll read a few of these out. Being in nature, playing with my children, my career, quality time with loved ones, friendship, exercise, meditation, a good book, service, watching birds, family, pets, friends, time to be still, solving hard problems, teaching, laughing, safety, God. And the list goes on, and there's many more flying past. But even in that short sample, Arthur, I think I'm feeling a combination of many of the things that you hinted at there. How do you feel as you see that list?
So a couple of things in just the list that you made. So there's two things going on here. One of them is actually an understanding that well-being is about more than happiness. It's also about unhappiness. And unhappiness and happiness actually are different phenomena, largely proceeding from different hemispherically lateralized parts of the brain. Unhappy cognition and experience largely proceeds from the right hemisphere of the brain. Happier feelings from the left side of the brain, the limbic system, the left side of the limbic system, to be more precise. When the things that we're talking about, like exercise doesn't raise happiness, it lowers unhappiness, and that's good for well-being. That's one of the reasons that in my own studies of affect, which is to say the prevalence that people have of mood, the people who are that are below average in negative affect, that they have a hard time staying on exercise regimes, because what exercise does is it lowers negative affect. And if you're already low in negative affect, you're not going to feel so much better after you exercise. People who have really high negative affect, like me, I exercise, I feel way better. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to exercise for the rest of my life. But that's one of the things that we talk about. Now, that's an illustration of saying, yeah, exercise, it improves your well-being, but it doesn't affect your happiness. Okay, what affects your happiness? Well, the things that we talked about, enjoyment, satisfaction, and meaning. What are the strategies? Because that's really what people were throwing up in the chat just now, is the strategies. What are the things that happen? Those strategies are all coalescing in every word you stated around four big strategies, the habits of the happiest people. Now, there's some little things out there, right? But the big things all fall in your transcendental practices, your religious, spiritual, philosophical practices. You don't have to be traditionally religious, but everybody needs something that draws you out of you. Some people said mindfulness. Some people said meditation. Some people in the chat said walking in nature. All those things will do it, but you have to have a practice that makes you small and the universe large, because you need peace and perspective to be a happier
And
person.
sorry, just I know you're about to go through the four, Arthur, but just to say that's really about sort of feeling connected to something bigger than yourself. Is that what that category is really?
Yeah, it's connected to something bigger than yourself. More importantly, is standing in awe of something bigger than
Yeah.
yourself. And here's the paradox. Mother Nature, she doesn't care if you're happy, and she wants you to be the star of your psychodrama. The star of the movie is Mark, and Mark thinks about Mark. I mean, think about it. You dreamed last night, and you were the star of all your dreams last night. It's exhausting. It's terrible. You need relief. You need relief from their psychodrama. And the only way that you can do that is with a transcendental practice, whether it's studying the Stoic philosophers and following their teachings with seriousness. That's an example. Or listening to the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, or walking in nature, or a Vipassana meditation practice, or the faith of your youth. You need a practice. And that's really important. And when I saw this, the best scholar in the world on this is somebody named Lisa Miller, who's a neuroscientist and psychologist at Columbia University. And it's been so helpful, her work, to me, because, this has really solidified my understanding of my own practice. I'm a Roman Catholic. It's the most important thing in my life. And I understand how I'm not going to say who's metaphysically right, by the way. That's a different question. But it unambiguously leads me to be a happier person, because regularly, every day, every morning, it's not Arthur all the time. It's just not the Arthur show. It's so great.
Yeah. Okay. So that's one. So being part of something bigger, whether that's faith or your other practices. What
Yeah.
are the other three you were going to mention?
The other three, number one is family. And a lot of people talked about their kids, their grandkids, their family relationships, their kin-based relationships. That might be adopted people, that might in formally or informally. That might be your spouse, it might be your children, it might be your parents, it might be your siblings. Then there's friendship, which is another silo. But those silos come together in your marriage, in your spouse, in your partner. That's where they really come together, because that's the person who's both your best friend, ideally. I do lots of work on how to fall in love and stay in love. That's the most popular unit of my class for my 28-year-old MBA students, as you can imagine, because that's the business of life. That's the currency of life. That's how you acquire your fortune in life. And they don't know how to do it, because it's getting harder and harder in the modern world to actually to do that, to meet people and to have functional relationships, to be sure. But family and friends. Now, family is really tricky, because a lot of people are estranged from their families. And one of the things that I talk about is, and Oprah and I write about in the book, is how to repair relationships that are troubled, such that you can have the happiness that you deserve and that your family deserves. And what are the legitimate reasons to have schism? And it's abuse. And that's it, basically, what it comes down to. The modern world is trying to make us stop talking to our families because of things like politics. That's insane. That's just insanity that we would do that. But again, politicians and the media, they don't care. They don't care. They want you to walk away from your family, because that makes you a good product. When you hate somebody, you're always the product. Friendship is really important, because we're talking about. Go ahead. You want to?
Well, no, I just something I've heard you say about sort of doing the work for happiness feels particularly relevant here for relationships, because I think we're often given this sense, whether it's in our family relationships or indeed our loving relationships with partners and so on, or indeed potentially with our colleagues and neighbors and friends, we've got a sense that for a relationship to work, it's got to be perfect, and we've got to get on, and we've got to avoid conflict. And of course, we really need to do the work on these relationships. That often involves disagreement. It often involves misunderstanding. It often involves hearing hard truths about ourselves. And in fact, so we've got to let go of this idea that relationships can be perfect, and and just sort of tune into how we are and how others are, and still make this a priority, because, as you say, it's so fundamental for our own and our collective happiness.
Yeah, for sure. That the movie industry has done a lot of damage to normal relationships. The Disney relationship is not the real relationship. And then they lived happily ever after, and they were soulmates forever, and they had passionate love forever. And in real marriages, that's actually not right. In real families, that's actually not right. One of the things that I tell my students, for example, is the goal of your partner, your romantic partnership, is not permanent, passionate love. There should be passion, but not permanent, passionate love, because you'll go insane. What you want is what's called companionate love. The basis of good marriages is friendship. It's deep friendship. Now, I realize I told my kids that. They're in their 20s, and they said, "Dad, that's not hot." And I get it, I get it. It doesn't sound that way, but believe me, I mean, I don't know how, I mean, I've been married 33 years, and the basis of my marriage is deep, deep friendship. My best friend, the person who understands me, knows every secret, knows everything, is the way that actually works. And friendship turns out to be the basis of all family relationships in some way, shape, or form. And we forget that. We don't treat our family members as if they were friends. We treat them, we take them for granted. And we often treat them worse than we would treat our worst enemies. We would never say things to our colleagues or people at the office who irritate us the same way we talk to family members. And so one of the ways that I talk about reestablishing family relationships is on the basis of friendship, as opposed to the blood kin that takes too much for granted.
Well, we still haven't touched on the fourth of your four sort of pillars that we're addressing here, but it feels like a good juncture, given what we're talking about, to dive a little bit more into this topic of love. I mentioned at the beginning the Beatles saying, "All you need is love." I was struck when my colleague and dear friend Vanessa King went out and was at a Harvard symposium with you recently. She came back full of the joys of something you'd said about happiness is love. And of course, that sounds at one level something we've heard a million times in many pop songs. And yet there's something quite profound that I think is missing in a lot of our conversations about well-being. And I think you're talking more than just, love in a partner style relationship. I feel that here we're talking about the love we have for each other as members of the human species, and in fact some of the lack of togetherness. So maybe just say a bit more about happiness and love, Arthur.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I write and think and talk about a lot about love, because all of the silos, the practices of the happiest people, we're not even through all of those practices. They all revolve around love, different kinds of love. Love of the divine, whatever that means to you, love of your family, love of your friends, love of the whole world is instantiated in the way that you earn your daily bread when you're working to serve other people. It's all a form of love. But that begs the question, Mark, what's love? I mean, we started off with what's happiness. So what's love? And the best explanation of what it is, or the mistake that we make, is that we treat it as if it were a feeling. People will break up their romantic partnerships because they just don't feel it anymore. It's like, don't make the error. You don't need to be subject to your feelings all the time, because your feelings are a biological phenomenon having to do with the outside circumstances. They have everything to do with how your limbic system is perceiving threats in the environment. You shouldn't run your marriage that way, for Pete's sake, the way that works. The best definition of love I've ever seen comes from the great medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, who said, and this is the Aristotelian philosophy, by the way, this comes straight from Aristotle 2,500 years ago, that to love is to will the good of the other. Not to feel anything, to will the good of the other. That's what love is to say, Mark, I want your good for you. That's love, notwithstanding my feelings. It's not about liking. Liking is sentiment. But to love is a commitment. It's an act. It's a decision. And that's so empowering to all of us. You can love your spouse even when you don't like your spouse, by willing your spouse's good under the circumstances. And that leads to all of these really practical strategies. So one of the things that I find in my own work is that marriages that last have a particular technique. And here it is. It's where you recognize that you're making a decision as opposed to having a feeling. And when there's two mechanisms that we have. They're called approach and avoidance. In psychology, we have approach and avoidance all the time. Approach means you're going towards something as an opportunity. Avoidance is you're moving away from something because it's a threat. When you're annoyed and you're aversive toward your partner, you practice avoidance if you're going with your feelings. However, if you love the will, the love is to will the good of your partner. When you're experiencing approach, you practice. When you're experiencing avoidance, you practice approach. In other words, you have an opposite signal strategy. This is an incredible secret. It's revolutionized my marriage, Mark. I mean, for years I would say, it's like, she's annoying me. She's annoying me. And part of it is because we have a conflicted relationship. I'm married to a Spaniard, right? And we Americans, we're defensive and thin-skinned, but Spaniards are pretty quarrelsome. And so the result is all the time. And then I learned this. And now I know that when I'm feeling annoyed, I say, come on, now it's time for us to be closer. And that is to will the good of the other, her to me and me to her. And that's control. That's power that we actually have. That's how we can actually create the whole world not just our partners.
Yeah, I really agree with that. In fact, I mean, I've been married for 20 years, and I must say that my wife and I have found that we need to, when we're most feeling like we want to push apart, is when we most need to come together. Very much
Right.
echoing what you've said. I'm also seeing some great questions in the chat about how to deal with more difficult toxic relationships. I suggest we come back to that really important
Yeah.
topic in Q&A because I think it's so vital. So thank you to those who are putting questions in the chat. But we haven't really done justice to your four. So you talked about faith and spiritual practices, number one, family and friendship, and we've kind of touched a bit on that. And then what's your fourth area that you were going to mention, Arthur?
Fourth is work, but work with two characteristics. Look, we all work. It doesn't matter if you're working in the market or not working in the market. Maybe you're taking care of your family, maybe you're retired, you're working. We're all working because we're productive creatures. We're not sitting in leisure all day long. We do all kinds of things that are productive. Happiness comes from work when work has two characteristics only. Number one is you feel like you're earning your success. You feel like a productive human being. That means that you're creating value with your effort and value in the lives of other people, that you're recognized and acknowledged for what you do well. That's the reason that merit-based systems in the workplace create so much more happiness than tenure or loyalty-based systems in the workplace. Loyalty and tenure-based systems, they sound great. People hate them. Why? Because we're humans and we want merit and hard work and personal responsibility to be rewarded because we want to know that people are recognizing the fact that we're creating value. That's earned success. That's number one. Number two is more important, which is that we feel like we're serving other people, that we are servants of other people. When you feel like you're serving, that's the essence of being needed. And we need to be needed. Dignity comes from being needed. Despair comes from being unneeded. It comes from being superfluous. It comes from being, not an asset, but a liability to others and to society or to a workplace or to a government or whatever it happens to be. That's the best way that we can take people's dignity away from them is by treating them as a liability. So by serving other people, we prove to ourselves something very important about who we are as human beings. And that, of course, in serving other people, we're willing their good. And so our job can be an offering every single day if we think about it as such. We don't have to work for a nonprofit. We don't have to work for a charity. We don't have to necessarily every single day serve the poor. But it can be something where we are serving other people. And in so doing, that becomes a source of joy.
I really love how you define work as this universal thing, even if you're not actually in a job, you might be a homemaker, you might be retired, because actually the principles you've defined there, that the feeling that you're appreciated for what you do and feeling that what you do makes a difference, they are just universal, sort of almost like core human needs. We think about the core need for food and for shelter, but actually that sense of meaning and sort of connectedness and is so vital. And I guess it takes me to something that I hope builds on everything we've said so far, but it also links to the monthly theme that we're pursuing in the Action for Happiness community at the moment, Self-Care September. We follow a program all year round that follows a structure that many of you will know called the 10 Keys to Happier Living that my colleague Vanessa, again, who I mentioned, was instrumental in creating. And so every month there's a different theme. And this month we're talking about self-care. And you made a good point online today, Arthur, that one of the best ways to care for ourselves is to care for others. And I love how these two things are interrelated. But I've noticed a couple of things. One is a lot of our culture is not encouraging us to look outwards to others. It's encouraging us to be me, me, me. And a lot of the people in this community who are so pro-social and kind are actually really not very kind to themselves. So it feels like we've got this sort of strange thing where some of the culture priorities are sort of encouraging us to be selfish. And yet there are quite a lot of us who've got quite unhelpful inner voices that are being quite hard on ourselves. And I wondered if you see these factors at play in the people you work with, and maybe how you can draw some insight for us with these challenges.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good point that you're making, Mark. We hear more and more about the importance of self-care, and I agree with that. But self-care is fundamentally based on other care. Why? Because none of us is an island. I mean, it's interesting that, this is less of a Western concept than it is an Eastern concept. I've spent the last 11 years going back and forth to Dharamsala because I have a long-standing relationship with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And in the Buddhist community, there's a lot of, one of the most famous, not Tibetan, but Zen Buddhist koans is, what's the sound of one hand clapping? It sounds like a nonsensical question. It's an unsound sound. But the truth of the matter is that it's the kind of question that doesn't have an answer. It only has understanding of a concept. These riddles are dedicated to helping us understand something deeper that doesn't have an answer. And what is supposed to help us understand is the Buddhist concept of emptiness, the Buddhist doctrine of dependent arising. And what that means is that nothing exists on its own except in its relationship to others and to other things. You don't exist in independent of the rest of the universe. And by the way, the universe doesn't exist without Mark. That's the whole point. And so the sound of one hand clapping is an illusion, and your individuality is an illusion. Okay, fine. But this makes us understand deeply that the meaning of our life is undefined. It's an illusion when it's all self-care. That the meaning of our life actually becomes extant. It becomes real. It becomes visceral. It's a source of power when it's really other care, because other care is self-care. To the extent that our society is saying, you know what you need? Forget everybody else. Have some hot chocolate and a comfort dog. No, I mean, maybe it's good for the dog. Don't get me wrong, but that's wrong. That's simply wrong. I mean, look, I got the data. I've done experiments that show when you're lonely, the best thing for you to do is go comfort somebody who's lonely. Find somebody else who's lonely. If you want to be happier, go teach somebody about happiness. Why do you think we do this? Everybody, why do Mark and I do this? Because we're selfish men. This is self-care, guys. What we're doing right here, Mark and I, this conversation, and all of us can avail ourselves of this. And this is the point. When self-care on its own is one hand clapping, it's meaningless. It's an illusion. Only love of other people, only care, only the affection that we can have for other people, to serve them, to love them in the deepest sense, completes us as people individually.
I think you've put that so beautifully. And I was hosting one of our local Action for Happiness groups in my community last night. And something that emerged in that is almost the other side of what you've just been saying so beautifully, which of course is when we reach out to provide help for others, it helps us too. That's a beautiful reciprocity. It took me years to realize that if I was willing to ask for help, that was also a kind of gift to the other person who could then experience that joy of giving. And in fact, for me, the ability to lower my guard and say, actually, I'm struggling right now. Can you help me? Is another way of willing the good for each other, should we say.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
actually, I think many of us are sort of trying to struggle on by ourselves and cope, and actually being willing to sort of say, I need you and we need each other is part of building more community.
Yeah, you're making a very nuanced and astute point here, which is that suffering by yourself unnecessarily is virtually always an act of selfishness. It's almost always an act of egotism to suffer silently by yourself. And it's also, it's such a self-involved thing to say, I don't need you. I don't need anybody else. I can tough it out by myself. On the contrary, the greatest gift you can give to somebody who loves you, who is willing your good, is to give them an opportunity to exercise the good in your life. What a beautiful thing that is. But if you're too egotistical to recognize that or to give somebody the satisfaction of doing something for you, well, woe be unto you. You will continue to suffer, and you will not give somebody the opportunity that they should have for other care, which is central to their own happiness as well. I had a relative who used to brag that when I go to somebody's house, I don't even accept a glass of water. I'm like, I'm not inviting you over. That's awful. I don't want that. I want you to come to my house and take my generosity, and I want us both to feel better as a result of it.
I really love how I think it was Thomas Aquinas, that quote, to will the good of the other, that you
Yes.
mentioned. And we have this phrase at Action for Happiness, happier, kinder together, because actually our own happiness, the happiness of others and how we can contribute to that, and the togetherness of how those things go hand in hand, and how the best thing to do them is together. And I think willing the good of the other feels like a lovely embodiment. But maybe I could ask you, what are some practical ways that you have found, or indeed you might suggest, that we could bring into our lives to do more of that? So it's all well and good sitting at home wishing for others to be well, and you've mentioned reaching out to offer help. And how else can we embed that willing the good into our lives?
So there's been some pretty interesting research that tried to ask that question. There was wonderful, research recently by a psychologist at Northwestern University in Chicago named Adam Waits, who did work comparing the results of what happens when you do something out of pure self-care, do something you like, go get a massage, go eat an ice cream sundae, versus when you think kind thoughts about others, versus when you undertake random acts of kindness toward other people. And it turns out already the result. The result is that you most want to do the selfish thing, but when you do the least selfish thing, you get the most happiness. Because once again, Mother Nature, she's lying. She's a prevaricator. She's giving you, as we say in the States, fake news about your own happiness, right? So don't listen is what that comes about. But then you can actually be more scientific about it. Random acts of kindness, that's fine. Random acts of kindness, but calculated acts of kindness. Now things start getting interesting. To think about the people in your life and think, what could that person use? Now, one of the things that I recommend is to be thinking about the relationships that you have and that you really treasure, and writing them down, and always having a list that you're going through of what you think that person needs. Now, maybe that person needs your prayers. Maybe that person needs your encouragement. Maybe that person needs your help, but having a working list of what other people in your life actually need, and be working through the list constantly. It's kind of like the most beautiful to-do list you could actually ever have. Now, certain things that I would do along these lines. I noticed when I was a CEO, I was a CEO for a long time, for 11 years. It felt like 111 years. It was brutal. But one of the things that I did when I was a CEO is I recognized that when I gave compliments to the people who worked for me, it really went a long way. But it was easy for me to forget to do that because I was really busy, working on the budget, talking to the lawyers. I mean, it was brutal. So what I decided to do was I was running a think tank. It was a research institution. People were writing lots and lots and lots of articles and newspapers, and I would read a lot every day, and I would make a note of the 2 pieces of research that I read that I thought were best and most impressive. And when I would come in the morning, I would write 2 email or text messages saying, I read that thing that you wrote. It was really astute, and I learned a lot from it. And it was just a game changer. It was just these little things. It was like one of the things that I would tick off on my list. Look, you got to do the work. And to do the work, you actually have to commit yourself to the work. So it's worth creating a schematic strategy. It might sound like I'm being too engineering about this, but otherwise you're going to forget and you're going to miss the opportunity.
Well, as an engineer by background, I love it. And I'm a big believer in to-do lists because it's this idea of action for happiness. So I might just pause again, Arthur, with this lovely idea of willing the good for the other, and invite everyone here, wherever you are in the world, just pause for a moment and think, what's one little thing you can do to help create a bit more happiness in the world around you, with your loved ones, your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors, your relationships in the broader sense. What's a little thing you might do today, this week? And let's just read a few of these out and see what kind of ways you're going to will the good of the other, should we say. So listen, ask people how their day is going, write some thank you notes, spend time with elderly parents, do intentional acts of kindness, speak to my partner's love language, seek help, notice others, listen to others, give sincere compliments about strengths, feedback, a smile, call my mum, go see my refugee friends, be kind, do the washing up. I mean, a lovely list, litter picking, and many more. So I feel really uplifted just reading that list. How about you?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. And one of the mistakes that we make, however, Mark, is that it's actually easier to do these things for strangers than it is for the people who are closest to us.
Right.
And Terence the Roman said, charity starts at home. But really the love that we express often starts at home as well. And don't forget the people who are closest to you. Your spouse needs admiration. Your spouse needs adoration. Give it abundantly. Give it abundantly. And remember, notwithstanding your feelings, because love is to will the good of the other, and do a lot of that starts at home as well.
Arthur, I think we should move to wonderful questions we're already seeing coming in from the community. If you'd like to ask Arthur a question, please do use the Q&A function, and please do give it a little thumbs up if you see a question you'd like to have answered, because we'll choose the ones that have had the most votes. And I'm going to start with this one from Emma. So how does this work if you're more inclined to help others and you end up focusing on others and their happiness, and you continually deprioritize your own? I've certainly seen people who are always doing the kind stuff and perhaps not being as kind to themselves. Have you got any strategies there?
Well, that relates to it. There's an old expression. I'm sure it's in the UK, but we have it in the States as well. And that's a parenting thing where people will say you're only ever as happy as your unhappiest child. That's terrible parenting, my friends. Why? Because nobody wants a miserable parent, and you're not going to have help your unhappy adolescent by being miserable. It is not. We think in a way that it's selfish for us to be happy when somebody that we love is unhappy. Wrong. When you get on the airplane, they tell you clearly, put on your own oxygen mask first before you assist others. The reason they say that is you're no good to anybody if you're gasping for air. The greatest gift that you can give to other people is not just, eating all the pizza and leaving nothing for them, but it is taking care of your happiness hygiene. You know the science, you know the techniques, you're part of Action for Happiness. Really, what that requires is that if you're running a company or you're managing a family or you're simply part of a community, making sure that you're thinking about your own happiness, because that is the beginning of your gift to others. Now, self-care doesn't mean, look, I can't take care of you right now, I'm going to go get a massage. You have to use your own judgment on that. But doing the things that really matter for your own happiness is not something you can deprioritize, because that's selfish. That's a selfish thing for the people that you actually love by being an unhappy person.
I'm gonna bring together two different questions here. One from Vanessa, a member of the Action for Happiness team, who says, "Not everyone has close relationships to a partner. So, what would be your recommendations?" And then Anna said, "How can I feel less lonely? I feel that my expectations of connections don't match the reality. I've tried so many things, including acceptance, but still feel the longing." So I think it's just to hold space for the fact that some of us may not have those close connections, the close family and partner in our lives. And
Right.
yet I still feel your message is important. So how can we use that in that situation?
So I have a colleague named Bob Waldinger. Some of you may have heard of him. He runs a very important project called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It's the longest running longitudinal study. It's 85 years looking at people over the course of their lives.
We love Bob. He's been here on one of these events
Yeah,
before as
Bob's
well. So big
phenomenal.
fan.
And
Yeah.
those data have been a gold mine for us to look at what are the practices of people as they get happier. Now, some of them are pretty obvious. Exercise, diet, smoking, drinking, early in life, it's important for your happiness and wellness, et cetera. But certain things like having an active coping strategy for the negative things that are part of any life and getting good at your strategy, of lifelong learning, also very important for happiness. But by and far away, the most important of the 7 practices of the happiest people later in life is that they have strong, healthy, love-based relationships. He doesn't say marriage. Okay, now why? It's important because a lot of people either never got married or didn't have a successful marriage. He shows with his data that close friendships are also incredibly good, and a close relationship with the divine is really, really important for a lot of people. Not everybody on the call, but for a lot of people, it really can be. And so what he recommends is for people who don't have the the good luck that comes from having a solid marriage later in life, in particular, that they cultivate close friendships, close sibling relationships, but also close non-blood kin relationships to the extent that they can have closer friendships and or a much deeper spiritual life than they would have had otherwise. Because what you can find is that people can use alone time not to be isolated, but to rather to have a closeness with themselves and with their sense of the divine, and where you can get much of the love that we're talking about here. We have to be more expansive in our understanding within a society that valorizes marital relationships above all. That's just not the reality for a lot of people, and it's not necessary nor even sufficient for a lot of people.
So thank you. That's really helpful if we don't have that sort of close, loving relationship. Let's come back and address something I saw coming up in the chat a lot earlier on, and is also in some of these questions. And I'm going to paraphrase a few different questions here. But what do we do when we have close family and relationships, but they're toxic or difficult or abusive? We're in a family, we're in a relationship, and it's not a healthy one. What would be your advice there?
Well, to begin with, the most important thing to keep in mind is that there's not a relationship of value that doesn't have conflict. If you have a relationship that doesn't have conflict, it's not a very high stakes relationship, or you're some sort of ethereal saint. There's something about you and the other person where there's just, and again, it's interesting because I've talked to a lot of people. I mean, for years, I specialized particularly in marriages, et cetera. And, people will say a lot, we never fought once. And we just, at some point, decided to get a divorce. I've heard that a lot. Why? Because the relationship wasn't worth fighting about, is what it comes down to. It's now, some people fight a lot more than others and some people less, but the whole point is that conflict per se is not a problem. Here's the problem. The problem is that it goes beyond anger to a very complex emotion called contempt. This is what really drives relationships, family relationships, marital relationships, even friend-based relationships apart. And a lot of this comes from the work of John Gottman, which most of you in this community know. He's from the Gottman Marriage Lab that he runs with his wife, Julie. And what he talks about is contempt, which is according to Schopenhauer, the great 19th century German philosopher, contempt is the conviction of the worthlessness of another person. Contempt takes anger, which is not dangerous inherently, unless you express it in inappropriate ways. But anger is a hot emotion that says, I want you to behave differently because I care what you do and think. That's closeness, man. That's caring enough. Again, it can be too much. Don't get me wrong. But when you take anger, which is a hot emotion, you mix it with disgust, which implicates a part of the limbic system called the insular cortex, which is dedicated to detecting pathogens. This is what kept human beings alive before antibiotics and vaccines, was the insular cortex, which made you disgusted at things that seem rotten, things that seem dead, things that seem like they might be carrying a biological pathogen. That's a cold emotion that says avoid at all costs. When you express this toward a loved one, you got a problem on your hands. How do you express it? Eye rolling, sarcasm, derision. That's what expresses contempt, and that's what we need to avoid at all costs. Don't do that with any other human being on the planet, because that's what creates permanent schism. And it's weird. It's like, I wasn't abusive. Yeah, you were. Yeah, you were. And we have a habit of doing that. We look at the television and roll our eyes at this or that politician. We say that somebody has said the stupidest thing that we've ever heard. Social media is a contempt machine and is training us in the wrong way of dealing with our relationships, which is one of the reasons, since social media has been introduced, that our ability to deal with each other in a civilized way has actually declined over the past decade. We have more contempt in our everyday discourse because of the way that we've been trained on social media. So we need to retrain ourselves. And in so doing, we can actually repair relationships.
I think this is such wise advice, and it's really insightful, Arthur. One thing I would just add to anyone who is in a relationship that's abusive, or where they might be in some kind of danger, it is important to have safe boundaries and to obviously recognize that at some point that kind of intolerance becomes completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
Having said that, the advice you're giving is very generally applicable, and it actually also links to another question that's been voted very highly here from Abhinav, which says, how do you remain kind to others if kindness to the other is not reciprocated? And I think in many cases we might try to be the best in a relationship and then feel that we can, I guess we can only really change ourselves. We can't change another person.
Right.
What would you say to that?
So it really depends on what you're talking about with kind. One thing is to have somebody over to your house. The other is to have good manners, to act in such a way that you would want to be treated. And there's no excuse not to do the latter. There just isn't. On the contrary, your unkindness is an act of unkindness toward yourself. It's an act of aggression toward yourself. Buddha Gosa, the great 8th century Buddhist sage, one time said that hatred and unkindness are like picking up a hot coal to throw at somebody else. The one who's burned the worst is you. And that's actually true. There's no excuse for unkindness except a lack of self-discipline and a lack of self-respect is the way that works. Now, it takes a lot of self-discipline. I get it. But the whole point is that you don't have to go out of your way and become a punching bag. That's not kindness. Rolling over and getting hit is not kindness. Exposing yourself to abuse isn't kindness. But actually acting toward other people as you would want to be treated under any circumstances, that's a basic act of civility and kindness. And that's the least that we can offer. And by the way, that's one of the great sources of happiness in our own lives. Nobody has ever gone home and said, you know what? I wish I'd been more of a jerk. Nobody's ever said that. You're never saying that to yourself. What you say to yourself is, I could have been better. Yeah, it's true. They canceled my flight. It's true. I was, my boss didn't treat me right. My colleagues didn't treat me with respect. but I didn't have to act that particular way. And I feel worse about myself because I did.
But this actually brings you back to the previous question and that answer where you talked about contempt. Because I know personally, I might go into a situation with an anticipation of wanting to be kind to someone, especially if I feel that person's in a difficult place right now. And then something about their way they behave sort of sets off my kind of sense of injustice or something. And I suddenly am in danger of going into the eye rolling contempt behavior because I feel I've been wronged in some way. So maybe the question that I'm seeing a little bit hinted at in some of these is, how do we get ourselves out of contempt? How do we let go of that feeling?
Yeah, no, that actually takes practice. And I wrote a whole book about that called Love Your Enemies, believe it or not, about actually how to do that. Why? I only, by the way, Mark, I only write books because I want the answer. It's all me search. I'm such a selfish person. And I felt that I was falling prey to too much contempt in my life. I was living in Washington, D.C. I was working in the political environment, and it was very, very tough. So in 2019, I actually wrote a book based on behavioral neuroscience on how we can actually get beyond that. This starts with actually not exposing ourselves to the forces that are productizing us on the basis of our own contempt. And that means actually staying out of the sphere of political ideology and activism that want to activate us, that want our contempt, because it really does make us a kind of a putty in the hands of people who really want a lot of power. I could go on about what those personalities are that want that, but that's important. I mean, people who say, for example, that it's abuse if somebody expresses a particular political point of view around you. No, it's not. It's not. That's not abuse. The standard is too high under the circumstances. All you're going to do is you're going to do somebody else's ideological bidding. It's very important that we have a standard that's realistic about this. So standing up to the people that are apparently on your side, but really not, is the first thing that we need to do to actually stand up to a culture of contempt. Second, let's remember that moral courage is not standing up to people with whom we disagree. It's standing up for the people with whom we disagree against the people with whom we agree who are insulting them. This is unbelievably important. One of the ways that you can actually defeat the culture of contempt is to remember that all those people who agree with you out there, they're insulting somebody that you love. Every single one of us on this call, we love some people with whom we disagree in the current environment. And there's all these politicians and media personalities that are saying that people who disagree with us are stupid and evil. They're talking about your sister. They're talking about your mother. Stand up for the people with whom you disagree. That's really important moral thing to do. Third is start experimenting with how you feel when you confront contempt with love. See, this is the really interesting thing. This is kind of missionary work. Missionaries are funny because they get all this rejection. I mean, I've had missionaries in my family, and I'll tell you words nobody's ever said in human history. Good news, Mark. There's missionaries on the porch. Nobody has ever said this in human history, but they're so happy. And the reason they're happy is they believe that they're bringing light where there's darkness. Use that as a possibility for this secular missionary work, going looking for contempt where you hear it, and bringing love, bringing warm-heartedness, bringing kindness, and that will become your brand. That will become the person that you are. And it's so deeply satisfying to do that. It's actually fun to do that on social media and in person. You'll lose friends, by the way. You will lose social media followers because that's all anybody wants is to watch people fighting. But when you don't just declare peace, when you declare love where there's hate, wow, it's a completely different experience of life itself.
I'm getting such a warm tingle down my spine hearing you say this, partly because I'm trying to practice that, but also I came originally from a sort of Christian family, and although I let that sort of religious conviction go during my life, my mum still laughs at the fact that I've kept my missionary zeal, as she would call it, in a secular way, as you've described it, trying to spread love in a sort of non-partisan, non-religious way. So thank you for reminding me of that. We had one question that came in. I know we're really short of time. This may be our last one, but Stefan sent a question via email in advance, and it links to the fact that there are many people who are really struggling right now with the conditions of their life, but also with different sort of aspects of neurodiversity and different sort of personality characteristics and traits. And so Stefan says, what advice would you give someone with bipolar or ADHD or autistic traits to help them cope or even thrive in a cycle of depression? Is there, for example, a way to kind of work on happiness when you're unable to even get out of bed, and to even initiate self-care. So,
Yeah, yeah.
how do we deal with that kind of like quite extremely difficult situation?
Yeah, no. That's obviously a very serious question that clinicians have struggled with an awful lot. People, clinical psychologists and in the psychiatry profession, how do you deal with this? And one of the questions is, how does positive psychology and the science of happiness, how does it interact with therapy? How does it interact with psychiatric medicine with respect to mood disorders, for example? So neurodivergence is a slightly different thing, but let's take mood disorders, which largely are what we're talking about is clinical depression and generalized anxiety. How does it actually work? And the answer is it should be complementary. Anything that we're talking about here is not a substitute for proper medical care. It just isn't. But it's entirely complementary with proper medical care. Why? In the same way that understanding how to take care of your body with diet and exercise is complementary to going to a physical therapist when you're injured. Learning about these things and doing them appropriately can be really, really good. It's an adjunct. Why? Because it actually makes you stronger and it can make you better. Plus, one of the things that I have found again and again and again in my work is that people who have struggled with mood disorders, they are some of the absolute best teachers of positive psychology. They're some of the best, most gifted people I've ever seen. Why? Because they know what they're talking about, right? And so what you're feeling is like, I'm struggling. I'm feeling a little depressed. It's like, okay. Let's talk about what's really going on here. I'll give you an example. So anxiety is really unfocused fear. Fear is a biological phenomenon that is supposed to be, according to evolution, episodic and intense. Fear is moderated by the amygdala in the limbic system to make you hear a twig snap behind you and to take off running because epinephrine has entered your system vis-a-vis the adrenal glands in 74 milliseconds. That's the way it's supposed to work. But in modern life, we have all these stimuli and all these mild things, and so we're getting this little drip of stress hormones all day, because stress is the biological or is the physical manifestation of anxiety, and it's unfocused. So how do you actually deal with anxiety effectively in ordinary life? The answer is you focus it. You write a list. You say, here are the things I'm really anxious about. Here's what I'm really worried about. Here's what I'm afraid of that's behind it. What's the likelihood it's going to happen? And if it does happen in the worst case, what am I going to do? And you always feel better because you're biologically in line with it. Where did I get that? I got that from somebody who suffers from generalized anxiety. I didn't make that up. I got that from somebody who really struggles. So here's what I recommend. Absolutely. Proper medical treatment is paramount. Also learn about these ideas that we're talking about and share them because you have a unique perspective. You're an expert is the whole point. And I realize it feels like a burden, but a burden can also be a gift to the rest of us.
Arthur, we're out of time, and I love that idea that we're all in some ways able to be teachers, and of course that desire to will the good and to bring these insights to others is not only helping them but also helping us and each other. In a moment, I'm going to hand back to you for a final word before we part. But before we do that, I'd just like to invite you to join me and this whole community in something we call the checkout at the end of these events. So we're all just going to take a moment, and you can close your eyes if you'd like to, wherever you are in the world, but just to take a breath, just to reconnect with how you're feeling right now and what's going on for you, and to bring to mind this time we've had together with this amazing insights from Arthur, and to try and tune in particularly to something that you're grateful for, or something that you're going to really stay with you, or a real strength that you've seen in Arthur or in yourself in this conversation, and really hold that in mind. And with that feeling of appreciation, we're also going to turn ourselves outwards and just send some love out into the world and sort of leave here with a sense of not only wanting to look after and cultivate our own happiness, but to bring that more out into the world, into our families, our communities, and our wider connections, and the ripple effect we have. And we remember the words of the Action of Happiness pledge to create more happiness and less unhappiness in the world. Arthur, back to you for a final thought. How would you wrap up everything we've talked about today?
What a loving conversation this has been. Just the actual conversation itself has lightened my mood and given me has reinvigorated my commitment to these ideas. Why? Because this entire community is an instantiation of love and action. happiness, and love really are synonymous. And this community is an example of that, of the fact that love is happiness. So thank you for that. Thank you for the gift that you've given me of exposing me to this and making me part of it for an hour today.
It's been lovely spending time with you, Arthur. Keep up the inspiring work. And thank you, everyone, for being part of this. We'll see you again soon.